events in the meantime, including the birth of Lizzie Beardsley's baby. She, of course, is the young maidservant who is married to both of the Beardsley twins. And as everyone always says when discussing Lizzie and Josiah and Keziah, both of them at once. Possibly so. Anyway, this is from the later chapter titled Enough. I took my leave, starting from the spring house. Stood inside for a moment, listening to the trickle of the water in its stone channel, breathing the cold, fresh smell of the place, with its faint, sweet sense of milk and butter. Coming out, I turned left, passing the weathered palisades of my garden, covered with the tattered, rattling remnants of gourd vines. I paused, hesitating. I hadn't set foot in the garden since the day that Malva and her child had died there. I set my hands on two of the wooden stakes, leaning to look between them. I was glad I hadn't looked before. I couldn't have borne to see it in its winter desolation, the ragged stems blackened and stiff, the rags of leaves rotted into the ground. It was still a sight to strike a pang to a gardener's heart, but no longer desolate. Fresh green sprouted everywhere, spangled with tiny flowers. The kindness of spring laying garlands over winter's bones. Granted, half the green things growing were grass and weeds. By summer, the woods would have reclaimed the garden, smothering the stunted sproutings of cabbages and onions. Amy had made a new vegetable patch near the old cabin. Neither she nor anyone else on the ridge would set foot here. Something stirred in the grass, and I saw a small gopher snake slide through, hunting. The sight of something live comforted me, little as I cared for snakes, and I smiled as I lifted my eyes and saw that bees were humming to and fro from one of the old bee gums that still stood at the foot of the garden. I looked last at the spot where I planted salad greens. That's where she had died. In memory, I'd always seen the spreading blood, imagined it still there, a permanent stain soaked dark into the earth among the churned wreckage of uprooted lettuces and wilting leaves. But it was gone. Nothing marked the spot save a fairy ring of mushrooms, tiny white heads poking out of the wild grass. I will arise and go now, I said softly, and go to Innisfree, in a small cabin built there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honeybee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. I paused for a moment, and as I turned away, added in a whisper, and I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow. I made my way briskly down the path then, no need to apostrophize the ruins of the house, nor yet the white sow. I remembered them without effort. As for the corn crib and hen coop, if you've seen one, you've seen them all. I could see the little gathering of horses, mules, and people moving in the slow chaos of imminent departure in front of the cabin. I wasn't quite ready yet for goodbyes, though, and stepped into the wood to pull myself together. The grass was long beside the trail, soft and feathery against the hem of my weighted skirts. Something heavier than grass brushed them, and I looked down to see Edzo. I'd been looking for him most of yesterday, typical of him to show up at the last minute. So there you are, I said, accusing. He looked at me with his huge calm eyes of celadon green and licked a paw. On impulse, I scooped him up and held him against me, feeling the rumble of his purr and the soft, thick fur of his silvery belly. He'd be all right, I knew that. The woods were his private game preserve, and Amy Higgins liked him, and had promised me to see him right for milk and a warm spot by the fire in bad weather. I knew that. Go on then, I said, and set him on the ground. He stood for a moment, tail waving slowly, head raised in search of food or interesting smells, then stepped into the grass and vanished. I bent very slowly, arms crossed, and shook, weeping silently, violently. I cried until my throat hurt and I couldn't breathe, then sat in the grass, curled into myself like a dried leaf, tears that I couldn't stop dropping on my knees, like the first fat drops of a coming storm. Oh God, it was only the beginning. I rubbed my hands hard over my eyes, smearing the wetness, trying to scrub away grief. A soft cloth touched my face, and I looked up, sniffing, to find Jamie kneeling in front of me, handkerchief in hand. I'm sorry, he said very softly. It's not, don't worry, he's only a cat, I said, and a small fresh reef tightened like a band round my chest. I know. He moved beside me and put an arm around my shoulders, pulling my head to his chest while he gently wiped my face. But you could no weep through the bairns, by the house, by the wee garden, by the poor dead lass in her bairn. But if you weep for your cheatie, you know you can stop. How do you know that? My voice was thick, but the band around my chest was not quite so tight. He made a small, rueful sound. Because I cannot weep for those things either, Sassenach. And I have not got a cat. I sniffled, wiped my face one last time, and blew my nose before giving him back the handkerchief, which he stuffed into his sporran without grimace or thought. Lord, he'd said, let me be enough. That prayer had lodged in my heart like an arrow when I'd heard it, and thought he asked for help in doing what had to be done. But that wasn't what he'd meant at all. And the realization of what he had meant split my heart in two. I took his face between my hands and wished so much that I had his own gift, the ability to say what lay in my heart, in such a way that he would know. But I hadn't. Jamie, I said at last. Oh, Jamie. You're everything